if you look at San Francisco, Portland, Seattle, New York, Philadelphia, DC, on down into Florida, the cost of zoning as it relates to single family housing might increase or be 50% of the cost of the overall development.
Hi, I'm Gordon Lamphere, and welcome to the Real Finds podcast, the podcast that interviews key entrepreneurs, activists, and researchers shaping real estate and, as a result, our world. On today's podcast, we will be speaking with Jesse Saginor. Jesse serves as an associate professor of real estate development at the University of Maryland and has been extensively published on topics including affordable housing, real estate development, economic development, and real estate valuation. On the podcast today, we discuss challenges to creating more affordable housing, tactics for developers when engaging with municipalities, and strategies for successful office to residential conversions. It's well worth a listen.
Jesse, thank you so much. Thanks for hopping on the podcast today.
Thank you very much for having me, Gordon.
So, what got you interested in real estate?
So I think a lot of it just has to do with growing up, and I grew up in Cleveland Heights on the east side of Cleveland, Ohio, and just seeing how things would constantly change around me. So it's kind of this puzzle, and the pieces were continually changing. So, what used to be a restaurant might become, a parking lot, or something that was an office building might become something else. So the fact that this whole world around me was constantly changing was fascinating to me in terms of different uses, different things, how they interacted. And so that was just, growing up again in Cleveland Heights, Ohio. Then my grandparents lived in Florida, and we would drive to Florida because flying was expensive, and just seeing all of these other cities and seeing how the landscape changed from sort of the flat South Shore Lake Erie, going through the Appalachian Mountains, and then getting to, Georgia and Florida, where you had these flat lands and palm trees. And so I think just the way the world was configured and how these things would change, because we drive down almost every year for 30 something years. And so it wasn't just seeing how my city changed, but all these other cities were changing, and to some extent getting much denser. So we started to see a lot more traffic congestion and a lot of other amazing things in terms of how the world was changing. And so to be able to observe that, not just in Cleveland Heights, but it got me interested in real estate as well as urban planning and a variety of other things.
Change is definitely a focus of this podcast, and the whole idea that there's so much destructive and creative change going on at the same time. And so that I'm curious, in terms of that, what are you seeing in terms of some of the changes that are going on in terms of particular what we'd like to talk about today, which is housing and that connection that we have between housing and the workforce?
I think, to some extent, it's this concept of creative destruction. So in other words, sometimes we change as people. The things that we liked 10, 20 years ago, 10, 20 years later, they might not have been great ideas. So to some extent, there's this disconnect between where people live, where people work, and where people play. And to some extent, you see this issue of a lot of the housing, in terms of affordable housing, a lot of cities, not that there's necessarily any type of fair share requirement, but a lot of cities don't necessarily build enough affordable housing. And when that happens, you have a lot of people that have to commute. When they take, a bus or subway or light rail or drive their cars, especially if you're talking about driving their cars, then it contributes to traffic congestion. So to some extent, if we built for everybody, so not just mixed use, but mixed income, then you might, to some extent, cut back on the amount of traffic congestion that we experience. And then maybe cities would be a little bit more flexible in terms of requiring developers to include a lot of parking in any of their developments. So those types of things, there's this whole interplay in terms of how do you balance all those things.
How do you build for everybody? Because I know you mentioned that, and that's something that I think we all want deep within our hearts, a more just society, and society that can have everybody as part of it. But how do you end up accomplishing that?
It's a lot of perseverance. So real quick backstory, before I moved to Maryland, I was a professor at Florida Atlantic University, and I served as the chairperson of the Delray Beach Housing Authority. So in terms of building affordable housing in a coastal town, that's basically adjacent to the ocean, you had developers that are building multi-million dollar condos, and then you had the housing authority competing for the same land, the same construction materials, the same financing from banks to build something that was affordable. And so from the standpoint of perseverance, it requires a lot of assistance at the federal level, the state level, the county level, even the local level to put these types of projects together. So it's not just getting private financing, but usually you have to have multiple layers of public financing. And a lot of states and cities and even the federal government doesn't necessarily do a good job funding those programs. And just because they fund the programs, it's extremely competitive to get this financing. So in terms of something like low-income housing tax credits, we got tax credits for one of our projects. But once we were awarded those, we had to wait 60 days. Because during those 60 days, any developer that didn't get those tax credits could basically go through everything that we submitted in terms of the materials and pick it apart. So if we make one mistake, then we could essentially lose that financing and another developer can get it. So it is extremely competitive to get these public funds to build affordable housing. Now, the flip side is some cities have inclusionary zoning, where if you do any type of development that's residential, some portion of those units have to be affordable. In other cases, a lot of states don't have that. So Florida didn't really require cities to have any type of requirement that developers needed to build some portion of the units that had to be affordable.
So in terms of that, do you think Florida's model then was a better model, or is there a model that you've seen that's particularly effective at public-private partnership?
I would say, like politics, a lot of the financing is local. So if cities have things like flexible zoning, which I know, we're going to talk about that at some point, but if cities have more flexible zoning, then that means that maybe you could build an affordable housing development that doesn't require as much parking, which means maybe you could build more units and not have to worry about parking. In other cases, it is local funding. So in terms of Palm Beach County, they passed a bond issue that I think, if I remember correctly, was about $200 million for affordable housing development. And so part of it is at the local level, there's the carrot or the stick. The stick would be inclusionary zoning, where cities say, if you're going to build any type of residential development, some portion of the units has to be affordable. Then there is the carrot, which is essentially setting up a lot of incentives to provide gap financing for developers to make it worthwhile to build affordable housing, given how difficult it is and how difficult it is to package all the financing needed to build and develop.
I know you mentioned uh, parking, and I know as somebody who does a lot of developments in the suburbs, parking is always a hotly contested subject from both sides, from
Right.
people saying that we need more parking. We've gone into communities and tried to develop successfully, but required extremely vast amounts of parking. And then there are some communities that are a little more, I should say, liberal on parking requirements. And so as a result, they require much less. And so I'm curious, where do you come down in the parking debate in terms of what do you think the pros and cons are of, let's say, liberalized parking, and why has the parking debate become so uh, prominent in the world of development?
I think to some extent that's how you can prevent developments. And it's not even just parking, but if you're going to do any type of development or redevelopment, there's a pretty good chance you're going to have to do a traffic impact study or traffic impact analysis. And so when you do that, it's basically kind of, showing your hand to some extent of, yeah, it's going to generate probably some additional traffic. And so it's not just parking, but it's this whole traffic issue, which to some extent gets back to that point of, well, if you build housing for everybody, maybe there's less traffic and you have less parking. But in terms of the parking issue, it's pretty significant, because if you look at the zoning code for any city, it will say for specific uses, you need this many parking spots. And in some places, like Portland, that's the one that comes to mind the most, but they realize that a lot of these standards are relatively arbitrary. But it requires the city to say that, what, we know that these standards historically might be a little bit arbitrary. And so we're either going to be more flexible, or we're just going to say no parking is required at all. Just build and we'll see what happens. And so part of it is, again, on the city side, they have to recognize what works and what doesn't work for them. So there's no one size fits all solution to parking. Yeah, there are some people who say we shouldn't have parking at all. And the people that want to drive, then it's on them to find parking. but you don't want it to kill your business. You don't want people to have difficulty getting to whatever it is that you're building, whether it's retail, commercial, or residential, multifamily. So the issue is, how much parking is enough parking? And in the past, cities tended to err on the side of too much parking. That's why you had gray fields at malls, because for all these uses, you needed several hundred parking spots that nobody ever used. And so, more recently, they're starting to do some infill development on the periphery, whether it's pad sites for restaurants, or maybe they're doing some, low scale mixed use, or maybe mixed use with residential over retail, or maybe office over retail. So they're realizing that maybe we don't need all those spots. But then there are some cities who will say, we definitely need all those spots because there's parking issues. And sometimes parking issues is a good thing to have, because that means that people are coming to the area. That means that you're attracting people. But in terms of answering this question of how much parking is enough parking, we don't really know. So there's no magic formula. I just know that in talking with developers, uh, we did some research with the University of North Carolina, and they talked to planners, and through the Urban Land Institute, we got to interview developers. We did a couple of focus groups with developers at the vice president level or above. One of the things that they said was that the experience of the planners that they were working with in any given city was important, because if people want to see the type of development that a developer is proposing, a lot of times the planner or public works, whoever might be handling that function in the city, can ideally find a solution that is still probably imperfect, but better than having to abandon the development overall. And again, part of it is it's on a case-by-case basis. The rules of the game differ in any city. A lot of times it depends on the development, how much opposition might exist, if the people who are in that city council members, if they're running for election or not, or, a variety of other things related to the possible politics of the situation.
As a member of a firm that's done um, hundreds and hundreds and hundreds, nearly 1,000 acres of development all up and down this corridor that I'm sitting in right now, the different municipalities and how they react and deal, particularly their level of stability and their cooperative nature, can be just absolutely tremendous in terms of whether or not a deal gets done, how effective a deal is, how profitable a deal is, how well a deal works with the community. And I'm curious, what did you guys find in terms of, were there certain steps that developers or community can take to try to ultimately create that positive relationship?
Yeah, yes. That's the quick answer is yes. But the main thing that we learned from the developers is to have a pre-development meeting. So before you start submitting the plans and doing everything else, to just go and meet with the city in advance. Say, you're thinking about doing this type of development. And what that to some extent does is it might flush out some of the issues that you might experience further on in the development. So if you know that there's some opposition before you file anything with the city and it becomes public record, maybe reach out to that opposition. And yeah, they might not change their mind, but at least it's, being maybe not even transparent, but just reaching out and flushing out a lot of those issues. So from the standpoint of pre-development meeting, that was one thing that was relatively uniform, where it enabled them to know to some extent the internal politics of the city that might not be obvious to different opposition groups, to the track record that the type of development you might be proposing has had in the past, and how it might have triggered certain opposition or other issues within the city. So that was the one that right away stood out the most clearly across all the people that all the developers that we discussed this with.
I can't speak volumes enough to going in and spending some time and talking to folks at the city. I know for us, I was just recently on the phone with someone who called about a land site that we've been working with, and we've been on and off with the city trying to get something done, and sat down in meetings. And we have a number of uses that would be wonderful for the site. And there was a developer that called us recently, and their heart was set on developing this into self-storage. And we're like, no, self-storage is not going to be used, blah, 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 blah. So they get a big team together. They're like, we're going to buy your land for this price, blah, 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 and we're going to make self-storage. And they go into the city, and the city's like, yeah, no effing way. No effing way. And, and I think there's so often that groups need to take the time to go in and talk, because there was a great opportunity sitting there. It just wasn't that opportunity. And so often I think that there's a lot of entrepreneurial nature, even within cities. And I'm not the biggest fan of government, but there are big entrepreneurial steps that cities can take to work with folks. They just have to actually sit down and have that conversation. So as we have a conversation and we continue to talk about this, I'm curious, beyond going down and sitting down with the city and talking about opportunities that might exist, what are the biggest difficulties you see for getting something off the ground, like maybe something a little bit more um, uh, seen as sometimes toxic in the community, like workforce or affordable housing?
We built 60 units of affordable housing that opened earlier this year. So in January of 2024. And the original plan for this 3-acre site in Delray Beach was to build roughly 40 units of for sale affordable housing. So it'd be a combination of duplexes and single family homes. And we tried to do that starting in 2008. And between 2008 and 2019, this 3-acre property sat vacant because we couldn't get the financing to build this for sale housing. So we ended up having a public meeting again, the Delray Beach Housing Authority, it's a public organization. So based on sunshine laws in Florida, we have to meet publicly anyway. So it wasn't a special meeting. We advertised to the community surrounding the site, and we discussed making this a rental development. And we got we got a little bit of opposition because the whole plan was always to be for sale. And we met with various residents from the community because they wanted to be for sale. And we had to explain to them and tell this story that, yes, we wanted to be for sale. And we tried, and hundreds of thousands of dollars was spent on consultants to put together applications for different Department of Housing and Urban Development programs. Most notably, this program called Hope 6. It's like a new community development program. And we failed to successfully get the funding for this development. So when we changed it, we had a public meeting and we voted on whether to continue to pursue trying to build for sale housing or to do rental housing, because there were a lot more incentives and funding available in Florida to build rental housing. And then some people in the community thought we pulled a fast one out. And even though we notified them and showed public notice that we were going to have this meeting, had the agenda posted and everything else, when we had the meeting, there was no opposition that showed up. And so after we voted on it, it passed 8-1. And to go ahead and pursue rental housing, we had to meet with a couple of stakeholders from the community to discuss the fact that, look, we tried. And would you rather have a site sit vacant and do nothing beneficial for the community, or, given the fact that we had over 2,000 people on our wait list for affordable housing, build 60 units that will be leased up very quickly, 100% occupancy in no time at all. Plus, it's up to federal code, state code, the city code. It had amenities. It had a variety of other things. So it's not like housing built back in the 40s, 50s, and 60s. It's nice housing, 2-story housing. And so we were able to get people to at least support or understand why we had to change things. And so again, I think that addresses your question. I know it's kind of a long story, but a lot of times you can have a public meeting, and just because nobody shows up doesn't mean there's no opposition. It's once the changes start to happen and you see the billboard of what's going to be going on that site, and people are like, well, that's not what we agreed to. That's not what we were in favor of. And I mean, I could give a lot more backstory on this project because it was the third phase of a 3-phase project. And again, despite trying to do this, for almost 15 years, we were unable to get the financing to be able to do what we ultimately wanted to do.
I think there's definitely some truth to that. I know we've been a part of projects in our community or seen projects in our community develop that sometimes there'll be no pushback originally, and the worst case scenario is you have no pushback originally, and then when the thing gets built, that's when the community is deeply upset. There's a development that we recently were not part of, but recently came right next to a development of ours, and it has been so toxic in the community that there's no longer industrial development. There's a moratorium. And when you look towards the success of the community, what you want to make sure is, all those stakeholders are involved and everyone is situated in a way that, things can progress. And so as we progress on this, with this conversation, I'm curious, one of the things that's been probably the most hotly contested parts of the housing debate has been office space conversion. And so I'm curious, have you done any research in that field? Because I know that we have all of our listeners' interest peaked right now.
I'm in some early stages of doing research related to office building conversions specifically for multifamily, because that seems to make the most sense. And I know that there's this huge wave, there's this fervor throughout the United States because a lot of cities have office space with a lot of high vacancy rates. It's kind of like, well, what do we do? And so there have been a couple of, cherry-picked buildings, and whether it's Chicago or New York or, Washington, D.C. or elsewhere in the United States, where they're like, well, we're able to take this office building and convert it into multifamily. And so there's this wave of people that think that you can just take any office building and convert it into multifamily residential. And you know that, and I know that that is not the case. Part of the issue is some of the research that has been done, they basically look at older office buildings, which, let's say, built in the 1970s. And part of that has to do with the floor plate, because the floor plate, in terms of the building envelope and the distance to the core of the building, that matters in terms of, to some extent on a basic level, the likelihood of success in terms of converting it from office to residential. And the reason why is because things like natural lighting, things like how you would orient the units in the building to maximize the financial feasibility of that development. And so if you think about more recent buildings, a lot of them have much larger floor plates. And so in some cases, I think Gensler did a building in Philadelphia. And what they did was they essentially brought the wall in. So they brought the wall in and they create essentially like a deck or a porch, if you will, but it's on the interior as opposed to hanging off. And the idea was they shrunk it. So they brought the wall closer to the core so that they could make better sense of the living space and not have, still have some natural light, but also bring some amenities into the building. And so to some extent, that's just one of the simpler examples. But the other issue is you have to figure out things like zoning. Can you easily convert an office building into multifamily? What does the zoning allow? Because in a lot of places, you might not have a lot of flexibility in terms of rezoning an office building into multifamily, although a lot more cities would be flexible. The other thing is when you think about just the inner workings, HVAC systems, all the other systems in an office building, it's not easy and it's definitely not cheap to retrofit that to multifamily housing. So in terms of the cost involved with retrofitting a building, it's very expensive. Another issue might be, where do you put amenities that might attract people? Because a lot of office buildings, they might have that ground floor atrium when you walk in, but beyond that, they might not have a lot of space available. So in terms of the feasibility of putting amenities on the roof, a lot of these things all depend. So to some extent, there's no, similar to the other issues, there's no one size fits all, but a lot of it depends on, the condition of the building, when it was built in terms of the size of the floor plate. So for the most part, smaller floor plate is better to work with in terms of converting it into multifamily housing. And then there's just the additional costs. And so one of the things that a lot of cities are starting to do, Boston, Washington, D.C., those are the ones that come to mind, is they're trying to create incentives related to gap financing for retrofitting an office building into multifamily. And the idea behind it is essentially they know it's expensive. And also, places in DC, there are some submarkets that might have a 27% vacancy rate in their office space. So to some extent, they know that there's this problem and they're trying to address it, but they also know that a lot of banks are only willing to give so much money to finance the building. So a lot of cities are essentially trying to create these types of programs. Even beyond that, at the federal level, there was a bill that was introduced in July that basically looks at the 1986 Tax Credits Act, and the idea is to retrofit it. in terms of basically saying that it's House Bill 90092, and it's called the Revitalizing Downtown and Main Streets Act. So I had to read that. But the goal is to basically, it's real exciting. The goal is to amend the Internal Revenue Code so that it will create an investment credit to help provide funding to convert non-residential buildings into residential buildings. And so that bill was introduced in July. It hasn't gotten a lot of mileage yet. There's a little bit of politics going on. I don't know if you follow that, but
So yeah. So
but
what are the politics on that? I'm curious because we certainly see it locally within Illinois and Wisconsin, and we follow it locally. But I'm curious what you're seeing on the national level in terms of politics with regard to not only affordable housing, but particularly office conversions.
and that's the thing is, I think this bill has partisan support in terms of uh, realizing that there's this huge need. And so they look at, they look at things like historic tax credits, low-income housing tax credits. A lot of the other tax credit programs that were passed in 1986 have been very beneficial in terms of encouraging and supporting those specific types of uses. So in other words, without low-income housing tax credits, I can't imagine how many millions of units wouldn't have been built since 1986. And same thing with historic tax credits. Instead of bulldozing everything, you see creative retrofitting of things like churches, elementary schools that are no longer used into multifamily developments. And so the idea of taking on this conversion thing, you're talking about, buildings that aren't necessarily historic, that might not necessarily be redeveloped into affordable housing. So adding this change to the Internal Revenue Code would essentially provide another funding stream, because it's not even the fact that we have high office vacancy rates, but this work from home, this whole sort of pandemic disruption in terms of how we work and where we work has changed the scale of what to do with all these office buildings, because the nature of the way we work now and in the future is going to change. And so I think we don't want to see a whole bunch of vacant downtown office buildings. And so if this is at the federal level, it would lead me to believe that this is a national issue, and they're realizing that we don't want to have dead cores in our downtowns because you have office buildings and there's nothing providing gap financing or additional financing mechanisms to encourage how we retrofit our cities in the future.
So we recently had Joe Brady on, who talked at length about uh, creative destruction is great, but at the same time, we have these neighborhoods downtown that are uh, they're almost completely economically destroyed because you had huge, vast tracts of businesses that relied on commuters, businesses that relied on supporting these office buildings, and that unless we do something, we could have places like the Loop in Chicago where you could have massive vacancy in neighborhoods, which creates all sorts of negative externalities, right? So,
Correct.
in terms of that, what do you think ultimately is the most effective way that the government can partner with developers? Of course, I don't think it's politically feasible to, have them just rain cash down on wealthy developers. But at the same time, there probably are ways that we can make things work.
I think, uh, I think to some extent, with cities stepping in, Washington, D.C., Mayor Bowser, the mayor from Boston, her name escapes me, but they both created more local programs to kind of piggyback on it, because they have a better idea for how to channel this money. They have a better relationship, at least they have a relationship with a lot of developers. So part of it is essentially creating local programs that ideally make the most sense. So at the federal level, that could be helpful, but to some extent locally is where I think you could find more effective programs. But it assumes that cities aren't already cash strapped. So keep in mind, we're talking about Class A office space or downtown office space. That's the most expensive property tax revenue generator for most major cities. And so the issue is, to some extent, it's in their best interest to create these programs locally, because that will ideally, even if it might generate slightly less property tax revenue, you're at least going to have more eyes on the street. You're going to have more people living in downtown areas doing it. So to some extent, uh, I see cities as being the best way to maybe, not exactly like opportunity zones are set up, but to basically say, okay, here in this urban core where we have the greatest amount of vacant office space, we're going to create this localized program for converting these buildings into multifamily housing or something along those lines. So, yeah, at the federal level, it's nice if they accomplish something, but at the state and local level, that's where you can essentially craft programs that are more relative to the specific conditions that they're trying to address. But also, when you think about comprehensive plans and everything else, the vision that that city has for the future, they can craft a program to ideally encourage that type of development or redevelopment.
Do you think it's just cash that's the big barrier in terms of conversions? Because I know as somebody, as a developer who's engaging in potential conversions within our own area and that has worked on conversions of buildings, not necessarily office, but office to industrial, for example. One of the big gaps that often happens in the market is you see um, just the cost of converting is a lot more than some people would speculate. But beyond that, you have all sorts of other regulatory issues, like with floor plates, and you have issues like windowless bedrooms, for example, that some municipalities don't permit. And I'm curious, what are you seeing in terms of, are there other ways than just purely cash that communities can maybe facilitate more affordable housing options, or do you think that's, cash is king and cash will be the driver of the future?
I think, so on the one side you have cash. That's one obvious thing. But another thing is in terms of the flexibility of zoning. If a city says we're willing to, using the parking example again, if you're willing to require fewer parking spots or some type of waiver, whether it's a parking waiver or not necessarily landscape, because there's not going to be a lot of landscaping with most office buildings in downtown areas. But those types of amenities, there are ways that the cities can work to relax or maybe be more flexible as it relates to the specific project. But yeah, you do mention an important issue in terms of ingress and egress and things like fire escapes and other things that ultimately change the nature of a building. And again, when you're trying to retrofit it and you're trying to add in all these things to make it safe as a residential structure, it does become a lot more expensive, unfortunately. So I think it's hard to avoid the cash aspect of these types of developments because there's going to be money spent either way. And the other thing is, I need to do more research on this, but I don't know if banks see retrofitting buildings as risk. Because if they see them as riskier, you might need the additional funding. You might need more gap financing to make these types of conversions more of a reality. Because when you think about the history of banks, they've always seen new things as risky, which, to some extent, they should be conservative. But even when you think about brownfield remediation, way back in the day, if a site was contaminated, banks wouldn't lend any money. So then government stepped in with some brownfield remediation. We had people with the expertise in terms of brownfield remediation. So it became this sort of industry that enabled banks to become a little bit more comfortable because there were enough examples where they could see, yeah, you can get rid of contamination and build useful development. And then you had things like historic tax credits, low-income housing tax credits. So in terms of the possibility of a tax credit to convert multi or office space into multifamily, that could help. And depending on how banks see these types of developments as risky or not, because right now, I don't know, I would assume that banks are seeing new office buildings as being pretty risky. So in terms of converting something, a lot of times banks are a little bit more conservative. They're a little bit more hesitant because they hope it works, but they also know that there's a chance that it might not work. And given when you think about how many commercial mortgage-backed securities are coming due, and the number of buildings that are in financial distress right now, they might be a little bit more willing to take that risk in terms of converting it to multifamily.
All right.
But again,
Well,
I'm not a banker, so
as someone who has worked with a firm that helped for some investors go and purchase some distressed office and turn them cash positive, I'll say this definitively. I think that yes, banks are incredibly conservative, and they should be. And when we get into trouble, it's often when they're not as conservative as they should be. But in terms of looking at long term, I think there's a lot of banks and a lot of distressed developments that are doing a dance right now. And
Right.
I think there are some banks that would be very happy to take a little risk to end that dance. So we might get into that circumstance. In terms of doing a dance, I know we've been dancing around the zoning issue, and the zoning issue is probably the issue of our times. And I know, particularly as we get into discussions of Moore's law and change in terms of
Yeah.
how things are changing so quickly and creative destruction, it's very easy to understand that the world is changing, and so does the fundamental underpinnings of how we zone our society. So I'm curious, what do you see in terms of like good and bad zoning policy? Because I know that I like flexible zoning as a developer, but at the same time, I'm not sure I want massive, uh, oil manufacturing plant right next to my house. So I'm curious, where do you see that balance, and where do you see like good and bad zoning policy?
It's an equation that we've never been able to balance well. The idea of supply and demand, just in terms of cities, what cities need, what the population needs, what uh, the commercial sector needs, all these things, we've never come up with perfect zoning. So to some extent, think about the tax code. I'm not trying to make this segment real exciting, but the tax code has never really been changed that significantly over time. We like kind of nitpick things and we make modifications. Zoning is essentially very similar. The original zoning that most cities had was single use zoning. So you put the residential in one place, you put office in another place, you put retail in another place, and you put industrial uses in another place. And that's how things were early on in the early 1900s. And then as things changed, we might put overlay districts. So like a historic district to try and protect historic structures, or we'll do a mixed use overlay district, but you still have that single use zoning. So to some extent, there haven't really been any major reforms. We just keep sort of stacking things onto it to make it more flexible. So to some extent, good zoning, I would say, a little bit more flexible, where bad zoning in some areas can be very restrictive. So in other words, even if it's residential zoning, within that zoning, there could be significant requirements to build even single family residential. And so one of my colleagues from the University of Pennsylvania, Joseph Giorco, they did a report a couple of years ago that actually looked at the cost of zoning. And in some areas, such as the coast, actually Chicago is, I think, the only non-coastal city that's included. But if you look at San Francisco, Portland, Seattle, New York, Philadelphia, DC, on down into Florida, the cost of zoning as it relates to single family housing might increase or be 50% of the cost of the overall development. Because when it comes to zoning, even within zoning, it's not just single family residential, but it's where do you put the driveway? What other requirements are needed? Does it have to be LEED certified in terms of being sustainable? Does it have to have landscaping? Does it have to have a variety of other things? So those minimum standards can actually, to some extent, make the cost of development more expensive, even if we're not talking about a mixed use development, even if we're talking about single site zoning. And so that's where I think the flexible zoning is important, because if cities and developers want to see essentially the same type of future, and that future would be related to the project, they should have some flexibility. But flexibility doesn't mean kind of going back to the Wild West before zoning existed and you just build whatever you want. Because even you mentioned you don't really want to live near a factory. So to some extent, the zoning still can make some sense when it comes to things like industrial uses and where you put those. And maybe we've done enough environmental studies that maybe we don't want to build a single family development right next to that industrial unit. But, so bad zoning, I think, would be something that's extremely strict. And you see that basically everywhere. So in other words, in Arlington, Virginia, just last week, they shot down, sorry, it was a lawsuit. They lost a lawsuit that would basically increase the density allowance of building developments in a strictly residential area. So that would enable them to either build more units that might make it more affordable to build more units in the single family area. And it was essentially shot down as being not necessarily illegal, but imperfect, for lack of better words. So even if you want to change zoning in a single family area to increase density, there's still quite a bit of opposition to that, even if it might make sense. So it gets back to this whole not in my backyard. So we want to see things, but to some extent, just not in our backyards.
Look, I'm okay even with maybe even a light industrial factory in my backyard. But as a developer, but I think the not in my backyard thing is real. I know we've talked about that on the podcast, and it's a balance, and I think the balance is really biggest where we start to get into the post-industrial age. Just as I mentioned, there's a big difference in today's world between light industrial and like a heavy petroleum manufacturer. And now we live into this age where some of our zoning policy was built on, early 1900s law, where, factories and environmental codes were vastly different than they are today. I know I can look out my window and I can see there's a factory from a major company that's a tenant of ours. And there's no fumes, there's nothing. I mean, it's a very different world versus it was in 1900. So I'm curious in terms of looking towards the future and looking back to the past. I'd like to transition to kind of our final four, and I think we can talk about this in that. But where do you see the future of zoning going in commercial real estate, like as we transition to uh, a new digital age and a new age of information over that traditional industrial age?
So I think you raise a good point about industry having a negative stigma. Because the idea is that when you mention industry, it means some large factory that's going to be spewing out, noxious gases or other chemicals or other negative things that you affiliate with early 1900s industry. So part of it is looking at it from a segmentation aspect. There's large industry, there's light industrial, and some cities have done a better job defining that than others. But even if you're talking about light industrial or last mile logistics, part of it is, okay, that's another traffic issue. And so part of it is, when are you going to see the most traffic? Is it going to be at night when people aren't on the roads, or is it going to be, when people are trying to take their kids to school or trying to leave for work? So, so there, in terms of how things are oriented, again, it goes back to when I was a kid, and this was a puzzle where the pieces are constantly changing. And the cities and the developers that succeed are going to be the ones that understand how those pieces are changing and how to maximize what that puzzle looks like in the future. And so, maybe we build smaller office buildings with the idea of smaller floor plates, so that maybe it's not going to be office forever, so that we can retrofit it to residential. Because most office buildings, that's not what people were thinking about when they built that office building. So in terms of maybe looking at more flexibility in terms of what we build now, because when you think about things, even something as simple as a CVS, they're laying off a bunch of people, they're closing a bunch of stores. What do you do with that space left behind? And so part of it is looking at things like adaptive reuse, and not just office buildings and the multifamily, but just everything. And the people who are able to get expertise in that area and figure it out in a way that makes financial sense, and figure out how to do that feasibility and market analysis study so that they can become experts on these types of things. That's going to be, to some extent, that's going to be the way that, again, developers, cities succeed in the future.
Yeah, yeah, no, I can't speak volumes enough on that. That's something that we're actively engaged in, and that would be, I'd say, a central part of the future of what we're working with a wide range of developers and investors is looking at adaptive reuse, even if it's adaptive reuse just of land that's been vacant for a while, or adaptive reuse of buildings, which we've done and are continuing to do in this market, particularly in dense, highly developed areas like Chicago. As the world gets denser, you're going to see increasingly more the need for change and creative destruction. I, I'm curious in terms of that. I'd like to double back on that question because I think
Right.
it's particularly important. How can communities best participate in trying to renew their communities versus take that NIMBY attitude? Like if there's a member of a development or a community group that's sitting on here that wants more redevelopment in their community, how can they reach out and or at least participate in positive change in their community?
I think the important thing is to get involved, and whether it's being on an assistant advisory board, but every city has a comprehensive plan, some vision for the future, and cities have to update these from time to time. And so, it's important to get involved, to go to those meetings. So if you haven't read it, just read the city's comprehensive plan, because to some extent, that plan might have originally been written in 1980, 1990, 2000, 2010. Basically anything written pre-pandemic essentially needs to be rewritten because we've had some things have gotten uh, things are a little bit different now. So in terms of that ability of getting involved with cities, and again, this Delray Beach Housing Authority, I was appointed by the Delray Beach City Council to this position. So that's how I got involved in affordable housing and learning about the process. So there's always opportunities to get involved with cities, but so I'm going to highly recommend that. I know a lot of people might not necessarily be interested in public meetings, but it gives you a better idea and appreciation to some extent for why things are the way they are, why change is so difficult, but to some extent also enables you to be part of that change that hopefully, you would like to see in terms of revisions to the comprehensive plan or other things that the city might be trying to do in the future.
Well, I'm personally working with a couple of different communities on their comprehensive plan right now, and sometimes it can seem brutal going through that process, but it's absolutely necessary. One of the things that we like to talk about that's a necessary part of life is growing up, and we have probably a good cadre of individuals on this podcast that are younger people in the real estate world. And so I'm curious if you had a tidbit of advice for anybody who was just starting off in real estate who maybe was more academically inclined, like yourself.
I think to some extent, we all kind of start off as specialists. We have to show what we have expertise in to get a job, whether it's, me becoming a professor or somebody getting that first job. But I think it's important to keep in mind to also become a very good generalist. And that means reading things that you might not necessarily read. What a lot of people don't know is when you get a PhD, nobody tells you or teaches you how to teach. So I read a lot of books about teaching. And to some extent, those books on teaching actually helped me become a somewhat better public speaker in terms of communicating ideas. So to some extent, reading things that you might not know about or things that you didn't have time to learn about in school. I mean, I still read, although it's not exciting, I'll read things about finance or, I'll read things about artificial intelligence. So I guess the main thing is to keep reading and to understand that you might feel like you know everything, but there's so much that you still don't know. And I know there's so much that I still don't know. And that's why I try to just keep reading, keep learning. I talk to developers to see what's going on because not everything that's happening can be found in a book or an article. So keep reading, keep talking, and and just keep an eye out for things that might pique your interest in the future.
So, on the topic of reading, if you could give one book that one of our listeners should pick up next, what book would that be?
So I read a lot of case study books of people in the industry, and they're all kind of interesting to some extent, but to another extent, they're all very siloed. So one book, it's a relatively recent book, but it's written by Tom Eisenman from Harvard. So he's written some articles for the Harvard Business Review, and he wrote a book about why startups fail. And he went through and surveyed a lot of CEOs, a lot of venture capitalists, and a lot of other companies, and asked them basically why they failed. And it's an interesting book because rather than looking at a case study, which to some extent you might read with tunnel vision in terms of whoever's case study that is, there are things that are unique to that specific case study, especially if they're talking about their successes. Success is not guaranteed. So sometimes you read a case study and you're like, oh, I can do that. But to some extent, it's kind of like, I want to call it like survivorship bias because that person succeeded, but it doesn't necessarily mean that you will also succeed if you follow that same path. And so this Why Startups Fail book, basically he goes through and he looks at just, maybe 100 something companies in terms of why they failed. So you get to see trends as opposed to sort of these cherry picked case studies that you might have read in the past. So it's, it's interesting because it gives a lot of examples of things that have failed. And to some extent, it could be the same thing that succeeded, but another person tried to do it, or there was a competing company and they failed. And it's essentially the same idea, but it could be the people involved. It could be the fact that they spent too much money marketing up front. So to some extent, I guess for maybe the younger listeners out there, it's a good book to read to see some of the pitfalls that you might experience if you're either trying to get your own business off the ground, or if at some point in the future you would like to create your own business. So I found it interesting in terms of, again, looking at all these trends in terms of why startups fail, for lack of better words, because most of them are not going to succeed.
Yeah, I think that's phenomenal advice. I know that there's all sorts of people that reach out to me that are younger brokers, and I'm not a coach, but I will take calls from younger brokers who are looking for help, and they'll always be like, well, someone told me to make 100 cold calls a day, and I'm making 100 cold calls, and I'm not going anywhere in my career. And yeah, there are these little bits of advice that we get, but it's great to see all the ways that where they fail, because there's so much survivorship bias, as you put it. I mean, if you just looked at Google, you'd think if you started a search engine today that you'd be successful. And I I think there were a lot of search engines that failed in that process.
Yeah.
Now, in terms of that, um, we're not going to fail at one thing. And there's one thing we will not let you get off of this podcast without discussing. And it's the whole point of the podcast, the whole reason why we started things here. And it's, we try to reach out to the men and women in the arena and get one name that we should reach out to next, and learn a little bit more about the real estate industry, or the way in which our world works in regard to real estate. So who should that next person be?
So I mentioned this firm earlier, Gensler. I mean, they have an office in Chicago. They have offices all over the place, but they're kind of spearheading to some extent this effort to look at converting office buildings into multifamily buildings. So, how they got involved in it is, I think the city of Calgary asked them to help them figure out a plan for all of their office buildings. So they created a model, and this model had, I think, 150 different data points. And so, overall, the model is pretty good. The only issue is, while they could select buildings that might be right targets to convert, the one thing that was missing is the finance component that they still don't have in terms of how much would it cost. So it's kind of on the feasibility end, but the person who created that, or kind of spearheaded that effort, his name's Stephen Painter. And I can't remember if he's in the New York office of Gensler, but in terms of what Gensler's doing, they're kind of at the forefront of this office to multifamily conversion. And so I'd recommend Gensler, but specifically Stephen Painter, because it appears from everything that I've read, his name keeps popping up. So, in terms of where they've done it, because they've done it in New York now, and Philadelphia, and a couple of other cities. So I'm going to toss that name out there.
Yeah, we'd love to have him on, but we'd love to get one more answer out of you. And it's for anybody who's interested in reaching out to you, that wants to learn a little bit more about zoning, real estate, any of the other topics we've discussed today. What's the best way for someone to get in contact?
Sure. I mean, best way is they can email me at jsaginor@umd.edu. That's probably the best way to get in touch with me. Yeah, or I can provide you with all my contact information. I don't know if you want to put all that on a slide in terms of phone number and
Well, we'll put it below. Jesse, thank you so much for hopping on the podcast today.
All right, no problem. It was a pleasure. I enjoyed it, and hope I left you with something useful.
Thanks again to Jesse. We appreciate his insights. And if you enjoyed the podcast, please give us a like, a 5-star rating, and a review. Your comments, interactions, and subscriptions truly matter and help us continue to provide quality guests. You can find us on YouTube, Spotify, or wherever you get your podcasts. I'm Gordon Lamphere with the Real Finds Podcast. Thank you for listening.